She showed him kindness when no one else did. But the boy she fed and sheltered in the shadows of the city was not just any child. He was the poor maid son everyone had overlooked, living in silence and struggle while the world ignored him. Eleanor Whitmore, a worn-out former governess struggling to survive, offered him warmth and care without asking for anything in return. While he carried secrets no child should bear and a patience that hinted at something far beyond his years. But why did he never speak of his past? And why did his eyes hold a discipline too precise for the streets? And years later, when he returned, grown, poised, and revealed as a duke, how would the boy she saved repay the debt of kindness she had offered so freely? And what had he endured in the shadows to rise so far above the life he was born into? Eleanor spotted him again that morning, standing silently outside the bakery, his coat frayed at the edges but stitched together with meticulous care, as if each repair were a message of survival. He was not begging. He was simply watching. She hesitated, the image pulling at something deep inside her. A memory of corridors lined with polished wood and golden chandeliers. Of children she had once taught to curtsy and fold napkins with precision. Children born into wealth, oblivious to hunger. The contrast made her chest tighten. "Good morning," she said softly, approaching him. The boy turned. His dark eyes, sharp and measured, studied her with an intensity that made her pause. "Morning," he replied, his voice quiet, yet precise, almost rehearsed. He spoke as if every word carried weight, a reflection of a life more disciplined than the streets would allow. Eleanor offered a small smile, crouching slightly. "I've noticed you here for several mornings. Are you hungry?" He tilted his head, considering. "Yes, but I am not desperate," he said. There was no arrogance, only control. "I can wait." A pang of emotion struck Eleanor, a mixture of admiration and sorrow. She remembered the Whitmore estate, the children she had tutored, and how she had once brought hot bread to an orphan maid's child in the servant quarters, only to be scolded for interfering with matters beyond her station. She had been powerless then, and powerless now, she realized, to ignore the boy. "Would you like to sit?" she asked, pointing to the bench nearby. He nodded once, slow and deliberate. As he sat, a small silver chain slipped from beneath his sleeve, glinting briefly in the sunlight before disappearing back into worn fabric. Eleanor's breath caught. The crest etched into the pendant, a lion encircled by 3 stars, was unmistakable. Ashcroft. The boy's gaze fell to his hands, hiding the necklace instinctively. "It's nothing," he murmured, but Eleanor saw the hesitation, the restraint, a survival skill honed under invisible chains of secrecy and legacy. She did not press. Instead, she handed him a warm loaf from the bakery. "Eat," she said gently. No one should watch bread like a memory. His hands trembled only slightly as he accepted it. "Thank you," he said, bowing his head slightly, not a street child's gesture, but a formal nod of respect. Eleanor's heart tightened further, remembering her mother's words when she had been young. Kindness is a seed that grows quietly, often in the shadows where the world cannot see. As he took his first bite, Eleanor allowed herself a flashback. Margaret Hale, a maid she had known long ago, sitting exhausted in the servants' quarters, eyes glimmering with a quiet dignity as she tried to stretch scant meals for her child. She had vanished shortly after, leaving whispers and rumors in her wake. Could this boy be connected? Could he be the son of the woman who had once lived in the golden wings of a house now swallowed by shadows? He ate silently, eyes occasionally darting toward passing carriages, the creak of wheels against cobblestones triggering a faint flinch. Eleanor's chest tightened. Every movement, every measured pause, carried weight. This was not simply a hungry child. He was a child of circumstance, molded by loss, trained by absence, and carrying a secret the city had forgotten. "I'm Eleanor," she said softly. "And you?" He looked up, hesitation flickering. "Daniel," he whispered. "Daniel Hale." Eleanor nodded, sensing the gravity behind the name. Hale, a name she had once heard murmured in hushed tones in servants' halls. But she pushed curiosity aside for now. Instead, she smiled, offering a hand to steady him. "Then Daniel, from today, you can sit here. You won't be invisible." He looked at her with something that felt like gratitude and caution intertwined. Thank you," he said. And in that moment, Eleanor understood. The boy she had chosen to notice had already begun noticing her. Daniel returned to the same bench the next morning. Coat patched with care, shoes dusty but polished in that faintly deliberate way Eleanor had already noticed. The city moved around them, street vendors shouting prices, the distant clang of the bell tower, horses clipping over cobblestones, but Daniel's presence created a bubble of stillness. as if the world itself recognized him as someone not ordinary. Someone observed yet untouchable. Eleanor watched him sit and unwrap the small loaf she had bought. Noting the care with which he tore it, the silence of his movements, hunger could twist a child, bend them toward desperation, but Daniel remained composed, as if each bite were a ritual. "You know," Eleanor said softly, "you don't have to be so careful. Bread is meant to be eaten." Daniel paused, a tiny frown knitting his brows. I remember how to be careful," he said, voice low. "It is safer that way." Eleanor's chest tightened. She recognized the rhythm in his words, a cadence not taught on the streets, not taught in poverty. This was training, discipline embedded into the marrow. She recalled her days at the Whitmore estate, teaching children who could barely count their privileges, molding them to stand straight, speak carefully, bow lightly. This boy, however, had learned that discipline not for etiquette, but for survival. "Who taught you that?" she asked, curiosity threading through the warmth she offered. He shook his head slightly, avoiding her gaze. "No one," he said, though Eleanor suspected that was not entirely true. A memory flickered in his eyes, like a shutter opening briefly, a woman with tired hands smoothing his hair, whispering, "Control is safety, Daniel. No one will protect you but yourself." Eleanor's heart lurched. Margaret Hale, the maid she had once glimpsed in the Ashcroft estate quarters. Could this be her boy? The poor maid's son the city had forgotten. Her pulse quickened as she pieced the invisible threads, the meticulous posture, the perfect diction, the small silver chain she had glimpsed the day before. "Your hands are careful too," she said, nodding at the loaf. "They're strong, but not rough. Someone taught you respect, even when life didn't." Daniel's fingers tightened around the bread. A flashback, only he could have seen it, of a narrow servant's room, candlelight flickering across the walls, a small cradle empty but for a mother's whispers. He had learned restraint because the world outside would punish noise, punish hunger, punish recognition. Eleanor felt the weight of it, the enormity of a child surviving with dignity when no one watched. You are kind," Daniel said suddenly, glancing at her with a fleeting warmth, "even when the world isn't." Eleanor swallowed, a lump forming. "Kindness," she murmured, "is a seed, Daniel. Sometimes it grows quietly in the shadows, unseen, until one day it blooms." She didn't yet realize how true her words would be, how a single act of noticing a poor maid son, feeding him, and offering him safety would ripple years later into a life-changing return. As Daniel finished the bread, he looked up toward the street. A carriage rolled past, and his eyes flickered, trained alertness, a habit learned under watchful eyes. Eleanor noticed the tension but did not ask. She already sensed that his life had been a test, forged in hardship, shadows, and secrets. "I'll see you tomorrow," she said softly. He nodded once, formal, controlled. "I will be here." And Eleanor knew, this boy, the poor maid son she had chosen to care for, was not just surviving. He was learning, watching, remembering, and she would be part of a story that had only just begun. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel's visits became a rhythm Eleanor both anticipated and depended upon. He arrived each morning at the same hour, careful to avoid the market crowds, silent but attentive, as if each step were measured to avoid drawing attention. Yet, beneath the careful exterior, Eleanor began to sense layers of history pressing against him. Unspoken burdens that no child should carry. One afternoon, a sudden commotion in the market made Daniel flinch. A merchant scolded a street urchin for spilling flour, and the boy instinctively crouched, hands shielding himself, eyes darting for escape. Eleanor caught his trembling glance and realized that the world had trained him to fear authority, even when it was harmless. His discipline was survival, honed under invisible chains, a skill that no ordinary street child could possess. "Daniel," she asked gently, "have you been in danger before?" He paused, brow furrowing, hands gripping the loaf he carried. For a moment, his composure cracked, and she glimpsed the boy he once was, the poor maid son clinging to fragments of safety, surviving in silence while the world overlooked him. I've had to be careful," he said quietly. "Always." Eleanor studied him carefully, recalling flashes from her own past, evenings at the Whitmore estate when a small maid's child would peek from behind closed doors, watching her aristocratic children play, never daring to participate. She had been young then, powerless to help, but her memory of that quiet suffering resonated now. She realized that Daniel's poise was not merely training, but a shield built in response to loss and neglect. As he spoke, Daniel's mind wandered, and a fleeting memory surfaced. His mother, Margaret Hale, standing in the dim candlelight of a servant's quarters, whispering, "Keep your head down, Daniel. Never show your hand. One day, they will see you. And you must be ready." Her hand smoothed his hair, and her eyes held both fear and determination. Eleanor's intuition sharpened. She understood the weight of that whispered command. It had forged the man Daniel was becoming. Even if he was still a boy. "You are brave," Eleanor said softly, noticing the subtle tension in his posture eased slightly. "And you've learned to survive, even when no one noticed. That's a rare gift." Daniel's gaze lingered on her, a flicker of trust breaking through his usual reserve. "You see me," he said, almost in wonder. "Even when the world doesn't." Eleanor smiled faintly, her thoughts returning to the silver crest she had glimpsed days earlier, glinting like a secret beneath his sleeve. Ashcroft. A name that carried weight, wealth, and power. Yet here he was, the poor maid son, unnoticed by society, untouched by its privileges, and hidden under layers of discipline and caution. A bell rang in the distance, signaling the approach of a carriage. Daniel's head snapped toward the street, his eyes sharp, body taut. Eleanor realized that his life had not been lived freely. He had been trained to observe, to react, to survive. She wondered what trials had shaped him into a child capable of such precision, and how the boy she was feeding would one day step beyond these shadows to claim a destiny no one could foresee. "You can come again tomorrow," she said gently. Handing him a small loaf. He nodded, a brief smile flickering across his lips. "I will," he said, bowing ever so slightly, as though acknowledging a debt he could not yet name. Eleanor watched him leave, heart tightening with a mixture of admiration and concern. She did not yet know the full weight of his heritage, the trials that awaited him, or the power he would one day wield, but she sensed, in every precise movement, every careful glance, that this poor maid son was destined for more than survival, and she would be the one who helped him remember what kindness felt like. The next morning, the streets were colder than usual. A thin fog rolled between the market stalls, wrapping the city in gray silence. Daniel arrived on time, coat buttoned tightly, hands tucked into pockets, carrying the same careful posture Eleanor had come to recognize. But today, there was something different in his eyes, a flicker of caution, of suspicion, as though he expected the world to betray him at any moment. Eleanor noticed immediately. "You seem tense," she said softly, offering him a bench. "Did something happen on your way here?" Daniel shook his head. "Nothing," he said, voice clipped, controlled. Yet his gaze scanned the street constantly, pausing briefly on passing carriages, merchants, and pedestrians. Every glance was measured, precise, trained instinct. Eleanor understood the weight behind it. He had survived this way for years. Every action calculated to avoid harm. She handed him a loaf of bread, watching as his fingers traced the edges, smooth and careful, almost ritualistic. "You are careful," she said quietly. "Not all children need to be." "Why?" He hesitated, a shadow passing across his face. Eleanor's heart caught, remembering Margaret Hale, the woman who had whispered lessons of survival in a candlelit servant room, whose hands had smoothed his hair while warning him, "Keep your head down. Control is your shield." She could see it now in Daniel's every movement, a lifetime of invisible training. Discipline shaped by love, loss, and fear. "I learned early," Daniel murmured, eyes focused on the loaf as if it contained the answers to unspoken questions. To be silent, to watch, to wait. Eleanor's chest tightened. She knew the lesson well, the lesson of silence. She had taught it herself, though in a very different world. Polished halls, whispered instructions, noble children learning manners and patience. But Daniel had learned it not for etiquette, but for survival. And in that, the boy she had fed, the poor maid son she had chosen to notice, was already wiser than many adults she knew. "You are very brave," she said softly, leaning forward. "Bravery is not only in action, but in surviving what others cannot endure. And you have endured much." Daniel looked up, and for a brief moment, Eleanor saw something raw, fear, longing, and trust tangled together. I remember her," he said quietly, voice barely audible over the fog. "My mother. She told me to always be ready, that one day, the world would see what I am. But..." His gaze fell to the ground. "I must wait." Eleanor nodded, understanding the weight of the words. The poor maid son had carried secrets too heavy for any child, layered beneath discipline, silence, and observation. She glimpsed the courage it took to survive alone, the intelligence honed in absence, and the quiet dignity he had preserved despite hardship. Daniel, she said gently, you are not alone anymore. You have someone who notices. Someone who believes. He looked up, eyes steady. I know, he whispered. And in that moment, Eleanor realized that their bond was no longer just about bread or shelter. It was a connection forged in understanding, respect, and the smallest gestures of kindness that the world had denied him. As the carriage bell tolled in the distance, Daniel's posture stiffened again, alert, calculating. Eleanor smiled faintly, knowing that each cautious step, each disciplined gesture, was preparing him for something far greater than the streets. Something she could only glimpse through the shadows of his actions. You'll come again tomorrow, she said softly. I will, he replied, bowing slightly, hands clutching the bread like a talisman. And Eleanor knew, the poor maid son who had survived the world in silence and shadow was beginning to trust, to remember, and to grow under the small warmth she offered. It was a quiet afternoon when Daniel finally let his guard slip, just enough for Eleanor to notice the small silver chain glinting beneath his sleeve. He had been hunched over the bread, hands moving slowly as though performing a ritual, when a stray shaft of sunlight caught the pendant. A lion encircled by 3 stars, Ashcroft. Eleanor froze, her pulse quickening. She had glimpsed the crest before, years ago, in the private wing of Ashcroft estate. Memories rushed back, polished corridors, whispered orders, servants bustling silently while nobles enjoyed life she had once only observed from a distance. And now it appeared here, on this small, disciplined boy, the poor maid son who had survived invisibly among the streets. Daniel, she said gently, trying to keep her voice calm. What is that? He jerked slightly, fingers tightening over the loaf. For a moment, his eyes darted, calculating. Then he slowly covered the pendant, his posture rigid again. It's nothing, he whispered. But Eleanor could see the hesitation, the tension, the story he could not yet tell. She nodded slowly, letting the moment pass. Some truths revealed themselves only when the world was ready to hear them. Yet Eleanor's mind raced. Who had trained him so precisely? Who had taught him discipline beyond survival, the careful gestures of respect, the patience to wait, and the art of observation? She had glimpsed fragments in his demeanor, the careful bow, the measured words, the alertness to danger, but now there was evidence, unmistakable, that his life had been intertwined with power and secrecy. Daniel's gaze dropped to the bread again. Eleanor noticed the subtle tremor in his hands, barely perceptible, and realized that he had been carrying more than hunger. He had been carrying identity, legacy, and a weight that no child should bear alone. She recalled flashes of Margaret Hale, the maid, who had whispered lessons in candlelight, whose hands smoothed his hair as she murmured, "Keep your head down, Daniel. One day, they will see you." She had disappeared quietly after that, leaving only traces of her courage and sacrifice. "You can trust me," Eleanor said softly, sitting beside him. "You are not invisible here. You don't have to hide." Daniel's eyes flickered toward her, a mixture of suspicion and longing. I have always had to hide," he admitted. "Even my mother. Even when she tried to protect me, the world was not kind. I cannot risk." Eleanor reached out, placing a hand over his. "Then let me help you, Daniel. Just a little. That's all I ask." A long pause followed. Daniel's gaze wandered to the street, to the distant sound of carriage wheels, to the shadows between the stalls. Every glance, every motion, was calculated, a boy trained for survival, yet still human, still capable of trust. Finally, he nodded once, ever so slightly. "Tomorrow," he said. "I will." His voice faltered, the weight of unspoken truths heavy between them. Eleanor smiled, heart aching and swelling at once. She did not yet know the full story, but she could sense the invisible threads connecting Daniel to a world far beyond the streets. The poor maid son, carrying the weight of lineage and loss, was beginning to allow a seed of trust to grow, and somewhere, deep in the folds of time and memory, that silver lion would one day roar, marking the boy's rise, the debt of kindness she had sown, and the destiny that awaited him. The fog had lifted that morning, leaving a pale sun glinting off cobblestones damp from the early mist. Daniel arrived punctually, his coat buttoned tightly, hands clasped behind his back, posture as precise as ever. Yet today, Eleanor noticed a slight hesitation in his step, a tiny pause before he approached her bench, an imperceptible shadow of doubt he was trying to hide. "You seem cautious today," Eleanor said softly, setting a small loaf on the bench beside him. "Did something happen?" Daniel's eyes flicked toward the street, scanning carriages and passers-by with the alert precision of someone who had spent years reading danger in shadows. No. Just, he faltered, shaking his head slightly. I must always watch. That is, safer. Eleanor nodded, understanding. The boy had lived under invisible rules, trained by absence and necessity, disciplined by the lessons his mother had whispered to him in dimly lit quarters years ago. Keep your head down, Daniel. Control is your shield. Observe, but never reveal. Those words had shaped every careful motion, every silent breath, every small act of patience that Eleanor now witnessed. You have learned so much, she said gently. Not all children must survive in silence, but you. You have learned patience, observation, and restraint. That is bravery. Daniel's gaze shifted to the loaf, tracing its edges slowly, almost ritualistically. Bravery? He repeated, as if tasting the word. I am just careful. Eleanor smiled faintly, thinking of the Wentmore estate years ago. She had once taught children who had been born into wealth the art of composure, the elegance of posture, the rhythm of etiquette. But Daniel's discipline was born not of privilege but of necessity. Every bow, every measured word, every alert glance had been honed for survival, not display. And yet, here he was, a boy of silence learning trust for the first time. Trust, she murmured. It is different from caution. You can be careful and still trust someone. He looked up at her, eyes narrowing slightly. Can I? His voice was soft, vulnerable, carrying the weight of years spent guarding himself against a world that had no mercy for children like him. You can, Eleanor said firmly. And I will show you how. A memory flickered across Daniel's mind, candlelight flickering against the walls of a cramped servant's quarters. His mother smoothing his hair with gentle hands, whispering lessons of survival, secrecy, and hope. She had prepared him to endure, to hide, to survive invisibly. Eleanor's presence now was like a bridge, small, steady, offering warmth in a life built on shadows. He hesitated, then nodded once, careful. I will try. Eleanor's chest tightened. The poor maid's son, trained by hardship, haunted by absence, and disciplined beyond his years, was taking the smallest step toward trust. She handed him the bread, and their hands brushed briefly, a fleeting connection, but one heavy with unspoken meaning. You will always have someone who notices, Daniel, she said softly. Even when the world ignores you. His lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, and for a fleeting moment, the weight of the streets, the loss of his mother, and the discipline that had defined him seemed to ease. He sat there, still cautious, still vigilant, but opening, just a little, to the warmth Eleanor offered, and Eleanor knew, as the city hummed around them, that the poor maid's son would remember this lesson of trust far longer than any loaf of bread. The days grew warmer, and the market began to buzz with activity. Daniel arrived at his usual hour, but today he carried something more than bread in his hands, a quiet resolve, a slight straightening of his spine that suggested he was learning more than survival. He was learning hope. Eleanor noticed it immediately. You seem different today, she said softly, adjusting her shawl against the morning chill. More confident. Daniel's eyes flicked toward the street, then back to her. I think I understand more, he said carefully, about kindness. Eleanor's heart stirred. The poor maid's son, who had survived on discipline, shadows, and silence, was beginning to grasp the strange, unfamiliar force that had saved him without expectation, the warmth she had offered him. And yet, Eleanor could see the weight of the past in his eyes. The memory of absence, of nights spent listening to footsteps that were not his own, waiting for someone who never came. Do you remember your mother? Eleanor asked gently, though she feared the answer. Daniel's hand tightened around the loaf. For a long moment, he did not speak. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, I remember everything. Her hands, her voice, the lessons she taught me, but the world took her, and I. His eyes flickered toward the distant carriages, toward the merchants bustling through the streets. I had to survive alone. Eleanor felt a pang of sorrow. Margaret Hale had been more than a mother. She had been a protector, a teacher, and the quiet anchor for a boy who would one day carry the weight of a legacy no one expected. She realized the enormity of what Daniel had endured, the loneliness, the discipline forced upon him, the invisible scars that only someone who had truly suffered could carry. You've carried so much, Eleanor said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. And yet, here you are, still standing. Daniel's eyes met hers, steady and unwavering, though a shadow of doubt lingered. I had to, he said simply. I had to be ready. For something I did not understand. Eleanor's mind flickered to the silver chain, to the lion encircled by 3 stars, Ashcroft. The name held power, wealth, and influence, everything Daniel had been hidden from, yet everything he had survived for. She realized that he had been shaped not just by absence and hardship, but by destiny, and the thought that this poor maid son, the boy she had shown kindness to, might one day reclaim a life he was denied stirred something fierce in her heart. "You are not just surviving anymore," Eleanor said softly, a quiet smile tugging at her lips. "You are learning what it means to be seen, and to be remembered." Daniel's lips curved slightly. It was the first time Eleanor had seen him truly smile, a fleeting, fragile thing, but full of promise. "I will remember," he said, "and I will not forget the kindness you have shown me." Eleanor felt a shiver of anticipation. She did not yet know how, or when, or in what form, but something deep in her heart whispered that the poor maid's son would one day rise, that the kindness she had offered without expectation would be repaid, in a way that would honor the years of struggle, discipline, and silent endurance that had shaped him into someone extraordinary. And in that moment, as the market buzzed around them and sunlight glinted on cobblestones, Eleanor realized this boy, disciplined, quiet, and patient, was no longer just a survivor. He was a promise of what could be. Weeks passed, and spring was beginning to bloom in the city. The air carried the scent of fresh flowers mixed with dust from the cobblestones, a strange contrast that reminded Eleanor of the life Daniel had survived, beauty hidden among hardship. That morning, Daniel arrived later than usual. His coat was more worn at the seams, sleeves patched, but his posture remained precise. He carried himself as someone who had long since learned restraint, patience, and observation, traits far beyond his years. "You're late," Eleanor said softly, hiding the worrying in her voice. Daniel paused, looking down at the bread in his hands. "I had errands," he replied quietly, his voice, calm and measured, held in unspoken weight. She noticed the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes flicked toward the streets, as if expecting trouble even in the ordinary bustle of the morning. Eleanor's chest tightened. Something about him was different today, heavier, more deliberate. She remembered her first meeting with him, the boy who watched bread like memory, and marveled at how far he had come. Yet she also understood that change often carried a cost. "Daniel," she began, unsure of how to voice the feeling in her heart. "You've been coming here for weeks. I hope you know you can trust me completely." He looked up, meeting her gaze, and for a brief moment, the usual mask of discipline slipped. A flicker of fear, of longing, passed through his eyes, and then was replaced by the calm, controlled expression Eleanor had come to recognize. "I do," he said softly, "but there are things you do not understand. Things from my past, my mother. Things that shaped me before you noticed me." Her mind raced. Margaret Hale, the silver chain, the quiet lessons of survival whispered in dim candlelight. Eleanor realized the boy's life had been measured in shadows, discipline, and absence. Yet despite it all, he had allowed her kindness to touch him, to make a space for trust, however fragile. "I understand more than you think," she said gently. "Sometimes kindness is all a child needs to remember they are not invisible. And you've taught me much, too." Daniel's gaze fell to the bread he held, fingers tracing its edges, a subtle ritual of comfort. I will never forget," he said quietly, voice steady despite the emotions he barely allowed himself. "The kindness you showed, it will stay with me, always. No matter where I go, no matter what I become." Eleanor felt a lump in her throat. Her chest ached with the weight of the unspoken promise that this small act, this fragile bond she had nurtured, would one day grow into something extraordinary. A carriage rolled past, the wheels clattering against the cobblestones, and Daniel straightened, alert once more. "I must go," he said. He paused, then added softly, almost as if speaking to himself, "But I will return, and when I do, I will not forget you." Eleanor nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Then I will wait, Daniel, and I will remember you too." As he walked away, careful steps echoing through the market, Eleanor watched him disappear into the crowd. The poor maid's son, disciplined, cautious, and patient, had left her side, but he carried with him a seed of something far greater than survival, a promise of repayment, of recognition, and of a destiny waiting beyond the shadows he had known, and somewhere in the quiet spaces between the stalls and sunlit streets. Eleanor felt it stir, the beginning of a story that would one day honor every act of kindness she had offered when no one else did. Years had passed. The streets where Eleanor had first met Daniel had changed. New buildings rose, carriages gleamed with brass fittings, and merchants shouted their wares with renewed energy. Yet Eleanor herself had aged only slightly in the years since she had fed the poor maid son. Her hair was flecked with silver, and her hands bore the marks of time and work, but her heart still carried the warmth she had once offered so freely. She was arranging flowers outside her small shop when the carriage rolled slowly to a stop. The world seemed to hush, as if anticipating something monumental. A tall figure descended, shoulders straight, posture impeccable, the careful poise of someone trained in observation and discipline. His coat was fine, his gloves pristine, and the sunlight caught a small silver chain at his wrist, glinting faintly with the Ashcroft crest she had once glimpsed years ago. Daniel, the poor maid son. Her chest tightened, a mixture of disbelief, awe, and cautious hope flooding through her. He approached, every step measured, every motion deliberate. Eleanor felt the weight of his presence, not just as a boy she had fed in the shadows, but as someone transformed by years of survival, education, and inheritance. The city seemed to fade around them, leaving only the connection they had nurtured years ago, fragile yet indelible. "Eleanor," he said softly, bowing his head slightly. His voice was calm, steady, but beneath it lay a tremor of emotion, the echo of the years he had carried in silence. You showed me kindness when no one else did. You believed in me, when the world ignored me." Eleanor blinked, emotions threatening to spill. "Daniel, is it really you?" He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Yes, and I have not forgotten. Every lesson you taught me, about patience, trust, and hope has stayed with me. Memories of the streets, of the bread shared in silence, of the lessons in trust and caution, surged through Eleanor. The poor maid son she had known was no longer a boy. He was a man of influence, of wealth, of power, a duke by birthright and by survival. And yet, beneath the title, beneath the opulence, he remained the child she had noticed, the boy she had nurtured with nothing but kindness. I had to return," Daniel continued, his gaze steady and sincere, "not just as a duke, but as someone who can repay the debt of your kindness. You gave me hope when I had none. You remembered me when no one else would. And now, I can honor that." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. She had never imagined that her small acts of care, a loaf of bread, a bench in the morning, a patient ear, could ripple through time with such magnitude. The boy she had fed in silence had grown into someone capable of changing not just his life, but hers as well. You are extraordinary," she whispered, her voice trembling. "And you remembered me. All these years." Daniel stepped closer, bowing once more. "Always. You taught me what kindness truly is. And now, it is my turn to give back." Eleanor reached out, her hand trembling, and for the first time, she felt the full weight of their shared history, the journey from survival to legacy, from shadows to light, from a poor maid son to a duke. And in that moment, the city around them seemed to pause, acknowledging the extraordinary repayment of a kindness offered long ago. A story of patience, love, and destiny fulfilled. The city streets seemed smaller now, as if they had shrunk to frame this single moment. Eleanor stood on the steps of her small shop, hands trembling slightly, heart pounding. The duke, the boy she had fed, nurtured, and quietly believed in all those years ago, was standing before her. The poor maid son, disciplined by shadows, trained by absence, tempered by hardship, had returned. Daniel's eyes scanned the familiar surroundings, the cracked cobblestones, the faded sign above the shop, the same bench where he had sat countless mornings. Every detail pulled him back through memory, a tide of images, candlelit quarters, his mother whispering survival lessons, Eleanor handing him bread with gentle hands, the small glimmer of hope that had refused to die. And now he was here, not as a boy, not as a survivor alone in the streets, but as a man who had claimed his birthright and carried with him a promise. "Eleanor," he said softly, voice steady but laden with emotion, "you showed me kindness when no one else did, when the world had turned its back on me, and I promised myself, long ago, that I would repay that kindness. Today, I do." Eleanor blinked, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Daniel, her voice faltered. The years, the pain, the patience, the quiet hope, it all collided in this one moment. "I never imagined that the boy I fed would become. The boy you fed became someone who remembered every lesson you gave," Daniel interrupted gently, bowing slightly, silver chain catching the sunlight, the symbol of Ashcroft lineage now intertwined with the human bond that had saved him. "I have wealth, position, influence, but none of it would matter without the kindness you gave me. You taught me hope, Eleanor. And hope changes everything. He reached out, taking her hands in his, the weight of years and survival pressing between them. She felt it, the gratitude, the devotion, the acknowledgement of every sacrifice he had witnessed and endured. He had learned patience, discretion, courage, and discipline in silence, and he had returned not for glory, not for pride, but to honor the woman who had reminded him of his humanity. You've grown into a man of integrity and heart, Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking with pride and disbelief. I only did what I could. You did more than you realize, Daniel replied, his gaze steady, unwavering. Your small act of noticing a poor maid son, your willingness to care when no one else would, that changed my life. And now, it shapes both of ours. The city around them seemed to fade into a gentle blur, vendors shouting, wheels clattering, children laughing, everything reduced to the bond between them, forged in patience, kindness, and unwavering trust. For years, Daniel had survived alone, hidden beneath discipline and caution. Today, he thrived, carrying the promise of repayment, the full weight of gratitude, and the dignity of the man he had become. Eleanor smiled through tears, feeling the quiet joy of watching destiny unfold. So, all these years, it truly was worth it, she said. Daniel bowed his head, voice low but filled with certainty. Always, because kindness is never wasted. And as the sun glinted off the silver chain around his wrist, Eleanor realized the full circle of their journey. The poor maid son had returned as a duke, not merely to reclaim his inheritance, but to honor the humanity and compassion